praten?
Hello, hello, hello.
No, normal.
Yo.
Do you want some tea?
Yeah, he offered me just now, and then I declined. But now that you ask, I kind of want to say yes. So yeah, it actually is really nice. But don't tell him that I said that.
Okay.
Thanks, Jake.
Yeah.
Pseudo Dionysius, een Neoplatonist. Yeah.
The intro got cut out, but you also had some other things to add. So go ahead.
Well, I would say there are a couple of useful resources for this because I'm very well aware that I'm not an expert on what I'm talking about, specifically regarding these, or especially regarding these subject matters. So there's a very useful talk by Bishop Barron regarding the buffered selves and the three Transcendentals, which he refers to from Balthasar and also D.C. Schindler, who talk about this a lot. So maybe we can link to the book in the description by D.C. Schindler, and specifically the chapter on the primacy of beauty, the centrality of goodness, and the ultimacy of truth. And we can then also, and which by the way also what Bishop Barron refers to, maybe we can even link like a couple of images, but I'm not sure. And then just look at the description, because there's also links to other talks that might help to illuminate on this subject matter, because they might be able to say far more insightful things than we were able to do in this talk. But nonetheless, I hope we were able to bring you something exciting and insightful.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me in our elderly home where we're gathered here for Christmas, and I don't know, it's very nice to be able to do this in person, because it feels like I think I watched this talk by Peugeot the other day. Like he's like, it's one reason why people think like, you know, whoever Christ is, like he can't have been born like near the December the 25th, because it's too perfect, right? It's like it's that time of the year when the days are so brief that it's like, yeah, okay, it's the perfect moment where everyone needs to come together and we need to celebrate light and all that. So yeah, I'm happy to do this here in person. It feels good. And other than that, I have to already say beforehand, I've been speaking mostly to to the fact of the matter that I do know a lot about. Like, so let's say someone like Nietzsche, and I have some expertise in it. And this, I have some, let's say, marginal interest and insight. Well, I have a huge interest and awe for it, but I would say I have a marginal expertise in it, in the sense that I've taught some subject matters that pertain directly to the Transcendentals and to the virtues, particularly Aristotelian virtue ethics. But other than that, I'm also a little bit of an outsider, so if there are any experts watching, I do apologize beforehand if I'm making any mistakes. And
that makes you the perfect guest, because I think Karen says it really wonderfully. She always says, we both don't know exactly what we're talking about, but I think that makes you able to operate also with outside of the expertise, because if you have a lot of known territory, it can impede your ability to draw connections. Sometimes.
Yeah, you're on a journey, right? You're still, and I can tell, like, now that I'm still, let's say, discovering this subject matter. So I just pulled this out of this is our dad's book collection. Him being a theologian, being interested in like an author like Pseudo Dionysius. I just looked into this, and it's just so fascinating to see him referring to both Plato and Paul, but from someone from the 5th century. And he's actually, the reason why it's called Pseudo Dionysius, because it's a pseudonym for actually an unknown author, because it is mentioned in the Bible, I think in the book of Acts, that I think Paul went to Athens and he tried to convert like a community there, and he just failed miserably. But then at the end it says like, however, you know, there were one or two people who were convinced, namely Dionysius the Areopagite. That's what this author used as a name for a long time, but later was found out, okay, it wasn't actually the same one. Cool. It's Pseudo Dionysius. That's why they call him Pseudo Dionysius. So this was actually 5 centuries later. Yeah. But my point is, in reading through this, it's just like it makes me interested, because like there's so much I do not know about this, and so much like for me, these, as I've kind of mentioned in previous podcasts with you, is like these are two, in some way, separate worlds for me. Like, okay, you know, I have my philosophical side, to which I'm like, let's say, fully committed, especially at the moment now that like I'm employed in the domain of philosophy as well, and I'm very thankful for that opportunity. And at the same time, you know, I have, let's say, a more religious dimension to myself, especially in my background, and to some extent what I'm also committed to. But as you know, like I'm not a churchgoer, for instance. So that's and I'm always thinking like these are somewhat separate, but in authors like Pseudo Dionysius, I could find that they can like overlap very strongly. So I'm very much encouraged by these subject matters of the three Transcendentals and then the virtues. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this talk.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
Where do you want to start exploring these?
Well, we can start by your own comment regarding Spinoza. Like you had a question. I don't know if you remember, and that's kind of when I sent you just a sort of a simplified image of the Transcendentals and the virtues and how they relate to the mind. Do you remember the question you asked? Or?
No.
Okay, so I remember that you were reading through Spinoza. You brought this up also, I think, in your conversation with Vervaeke, which I really enjoyed, by the way. I thought you did an excellent job, and I thought John did too. Like, he's just really a really good guest. And yeah, like you were reading through Spinoza. I think you were really enjoying it. You mentioned, but Spinoza is a rationalist. So, like, let's say he is like from the rationalist tradition, following Descartes, and then you get Leibniz and Spinoza were both operating around the same time. And I think what you noticed was that Spinoza really places a lot of emphasis on the power of reason. I think reason in the strong sense, not like, let's say, in the... Even though he is following in Descartes' footsteps, he's not like a Cartesian rationalist. He is really like the stronger sense of reason that we see appealed to by people like John Vervaeke or D.C. Schindler. However, you still had the very justified question, like, he talks about reason so much, he actually says reason is super important, but shouldn't he then also be discussing the importance of truth and beauty and goodness?
Yeah, I think he said it was the most important thing. That's why I sent it to you. It was this quote of saying you should follow reason above all else.
And I thought that was a very justified question, but then I also I was reminded of the fact, like, in some ways, and this actually takes me to some knowledge that I have pertaining to Aristotle. Aristotle, like, he wrote a book. He had a series of... He wrote so many books, like, as you know, but he had a series of lectures, which were named the Nicomachean Ethics, from which we have Aristotelian virtue ethics. So I think what we have remaining of it are his student notes by his students, but they're very enlightening and illuminating. And he discusses all the virtues one by one, how they work, and he kind of says, like, you know, the way in which we practice the virtues is by using our reason. So for him, also the reason is, let's say, the highest aspect of, or it's the most essentially human aspect, to say it in very simple words. So for him, you could also say, like, let's say from Spinoza's perspective, and some consider Spinoza neo-Aristotelian, to be like, it's the most essential human aspect. So it is the highest in that sense. But then it's used to actually, you know, practice the virtues.
Yeah.
And then Aristotle, because he's less of a Platonist than Plato himself. Well, he might be more of a Platonist, but he's less of a Plato than Plato himself. Let me put it that way. He is a little bit less interested in the Transcendentals, something that Plato discusses. But you kind of see that, you know, and this is also present to some extent in Aristotle himself, that he knows that, you know, you use your reason to contemplate, for instance, the truth or the good, by which you can then exercise the virtues, because, like, they stand in relation to our emotions, and I can tell a little bit more about that. But basically my response ended up being like, I can see why Spinoza thinks this is the most important thing, because he's talking about a different domain, right? So he's talking about the essentially human domain, like what can we practice, and then, like, in that sense, yes, human is the reason in the broad sense, again, is our highest capacity, and then that is the capacity that allows us to even make something like truth or goodness or beauty intelligible, and then relate that to the virtues that are then grounded in that. So that's kind of like been my response to.
It makes a lot of sense. Like reason is in service of the transcendentals and of the virtues. And I guess the Aristotle thing also makes sense in its difference with Plato, because Aristotle does seem to be a bit more of the world, let's say, a bit more of that scientific domain.
Right. Yeah. It's also an interesting difference, right? Because Plato comes from a Pythagorean tradition, so he is like mathematically trained. And you can see that, right? Like how like how his philosophy works, and then. Aristotle, I believe his father was even a doctor, right? So like you could see like he's much more empirical, and then that comes to you can see that in their philosophical systems. Even though both like it's a complete parody of Plato to say that he only wants the world of ideas and hates the sensible world, and the same of Aristotle to say that he's just an empiricist thinker, and that's, by the way, like it's so interesting because like his entire Nicomachean ethics. It consists of 10 books in total, and so many books are actually dedicated to very practical virtues, like let's say fortitude and justice, but also let's say honesty, the virtue of friendship. It's actually a beautiful discussion of friendship that Aristotle has. So and these are all, let's say, very practical virtues, and the reason why he discusses the virtues in the first place is because he prepares for his bigger work, the politics, in which he wants to talk about what is, let's say, what should lawmakers and, let's say, polis, city organizers pay attention to. Like, they should pay attention to a state that allows people to practice and exercise the virtues. And yet, in the 10th book, he says, okay, but the highest virtue of all is that of, if I'm not mistaken, like it might be a different word for it because I read the Dutch translation, but I think like it does consist in contemplative activity, and he says so because that's actually when we most resemble the gods. Like that's actually the aspect in which human beings most resemble the gods. So people are always like surprised by that because like it's the last book in this Nicomachean ethics when you should be getting to your conclusion. Like, okay, I'm really gonna tie it up to what's most important, and then he starts sounding like a Platonist again. So it's it's kind of interesting how that works.
Yeah, and I was also reminded of this idea that if you do this contemplative aspect, if you perform this, then the rest kind of lines up, if you know what I mean. Like you don't have to teach a Buddhist monk the 10 Commandments because it just comes forth from like, of course, I'm one with all beings, so why would I have to? And so that so it makes sense. Like reminds me of the chakra system, but I shouldn't speak about that. It's way beyond my expertise.
That's fine. I'm speaking beyond my expertise too, so don't worry about that.
Okay, so we understand the Transcendentals to be, let's say, the highest above the virtues, and if you follow your reason, then you are, let's say, your reason can be in service of those Transcendentals.
So it's almost like, in some ways, the Transcendentals are the water in which we're swimming. You could see it in that way. So it's almost, so it is the highest.
Yes.
In some ways. So like, but at the same time, it's the very conditions that allow us to experience reality in the way that it is. So someone like Peugeot often, as a like, this is why Vervaeke calls him a Neoplatonist. Like he talks about, recognizing this as a cup is actually seeing the goodness of the cup, is actually being able to differentiate what makes this a unique thing and celebrate it and recognize it and be like, yes, that's the cup, as opposed to everything else that distracts from it at the moment. Like there are so many things in the background, but also in the foreground. Like I could just be focusing on the handle of the cup or just the fact that it's made out of glass. But right now I'm really focused on, like, let's say, the cupness of the cup. That might sound strange, but that is actually to say in some ways that it is participating then in the good. Like the good allows me, this is Plato's discussion in the Republic, to say like, the way in which our intellect participates in the good is the same way in which our sight, our capacity to see things, participates in, and this is gonna sound strange, but in the sun, and that's strange because like you have the character of Socrates talking to I think Glaucon at the time, and he says like when we hear something, it seems like we only need our ears and obviously a sound. Like those are the two elements that you need. And then obviously Plato wasn't aware that there is also like a medium between those two that's necessary, because that's let's cut him some slack. It's the 5th century before Christ.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he says like, yes, but that's not the case when we're talking about sight, like when we're talking about seeing, because then we have, okay, so we have our eyes, right? And then we have an object, but is that it? And then it's like, well, no, I don't know. What are you talking about? It's like, well, there needs to be a third element, right? Light, that's correct, yes. Because otherwise, we'd just be blind. Like, if it would be in the dark, we wouldn't be able to see it. So, Plato is really pointing our attention to the fact there's always this third element, which allows us, and that's why he calls it like the sun, which allows us to see these things in the first place and really appreciate them for what they are. But then he goes further, because it's like, it's not just that we're able to see things because of the light of the sun, it's also that the light of the sun is that which gives every life its energy, right? Like it wouldn't be able to exist without the light of the sun. So he's going as far as to say, and that's the same thing as what the good is doing with the idols, like, right? Look, it's the idols, the Greek word for ideas, forms, aspectuality. It's a difficult translation because ideas sound way too conceptual, like we're just talking about.
Of course.
Yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to say idols right now. In that same way that we're able to contemplate those, and it's not because we have a direct contemplation of it, it's by virtue of the good that we're able to, like that we're participating in being able to recognize that. So both in the sense of, like light is allowing us to see something, so therefore the good is allowing us to recognize it, but also it's actually the origin of us as, let's say, thinkers, as experiencers, if I can call it that way, as experiencing rational thinking animals, and then at the same time also as all the objects in the world which allow it to be seen. And then we can also talk about beauty and truth. That might come a bit later, but that's like at least Plato's discussion of the good, which for him is the absolutely highest value.
Yeah. So does the good stand above the true and the beautiful? Because
in Plato, yes.
Yes, right? Because I've seen Jonathan Pajot almost equating the good with God. Yeah. Might be a bold question, but would you do the same?
Well, so that's the thing. Like, I started reading like Pseudo Dionysius, as I said, and for him they're just the same. It's like and that's also radical, because usually like people, because they're a bit closer to Plato, and I think most people associate, even like most Christian thinkers, because like there's always a discussion like, was he a Christian thinker, yes or no? Like he's just I even heard said like, was he just, let's say, a pagan thinker but in Christian sheep's clothing, something like that. So that's kind of interesting. But usually like they'll associate also goodness more with God than the beautiful, maybe, or than beauty. Yeah. And that's why people are more prone to say like, well, beauty, it discloses some aspect of the good, or it discloses some aspect of it. Like it makes it, it's kind of an aesthetic that lures us in to then experience the goodness. And there's so many things to be said for that, so I'm not against that. But in him, and he's a radical again, like he says like, no, they're just the same. Like it's like the beautiful and the good, we can really equate them. And one reason why that's also interesting for, let's say, a Christian theological perspective is because we talk about, so like now we're talking about the true, the good, and the beautiful. In a Christian theological perspective, you could be talking about the Trinity, right? It's like, it's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and they're all God, just like these are all the one at the same time, but they're not precisely the same as each other. So again, there's always this question like, how, do we order them, or are they all the same thing, but then how are they different? And you could ask the same question regarding the Trinity.
Yeah, because same with the Trinity, you have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Yeah. But I think if the Father is God, then you could also analogize that that he's both participating, but he's also fully it.
Right, yeah.
Yes, same with the good.
Usually I think they have like Latin graphs. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. But like when it's in Latin, it's like it's or I can also translate it to English. So you have the Holy Spirit, and you have God, the Father, and you have Jesus, and then God is in the middle, and it's like actually saying that the Father is God, but also the Holy Spirit is God, and Jesus is God. So all of those are equated with God. But then Jesus is not the Holy Spirit is not the Father, and the Father is not Jesus, is not the Son. So that's usually how it's said. And you could say something similar for the Transcendentals. Like the true and the good and the beautiful are all the one. But the true is not the good, and the good is not the beautiful.
Yes.
So it's I find it really tough because there are so many varying perspectives on this. But we can keep talking, and then maybe we can talk about maybe some sensible order, because D.C. Schindler also says, I think he calls it like he has a chapter in the Catholicity of reason, and even though he is a Catholic, it doesn't have to do with like, let's say, Catholic in the denominational sense, but just Catholic and pertaining to the whole.
Yes.
That which is also different from the Cartesian reason which we've talked about, and that he also argues, like they're all ultimate in some sense, which is why he describes them as like having the primacy of beauty, but then the centrality of goodness and the ultimacy of truth. If I'm not mistaken, I think those are the orders like that he gives to it. But then he also says like this is one way of ordering, and you could do it in a different way. But then he does give arguments why he thinks they're ordered in that way. So it's kind of it's a fuzzy subject matter, and that's part of the appeal, that like there is a mystery to it, and you can kind of see like if you get rid of it, you miss out on so much. So you want to keep it, but then when you keep it, you can't fully comprehend it, because again, it's the water in which we're swimming. Like you can never be fully aware of the water in which you're swimming, especially not in propositional terms, right? It's like something like and even it's kind of funny that I'm using that metaphor now, because I was listening to a conversation between D.C. Schindler and John Vervaeke, in which he quoted Hegel about Kant, because Hegel has like one sentence apparently which he refers to Kant. It says like, Kant just wanted to find out as much as he could about the water before he would swim in it, right? And that's sort of like a different, like he didn't want to get his feet wet. He didn't want to like get in. He was just like, okay, let me just analyze them. And then, well, we know this, like you can't fully infer everything just from this theoretical perspective.
Of course.
But we can still talk about the place of reason then. But I'm curious, like if you have any thoughts, like, what comes to mind?
I have some thoughts. The funny thought I have is that in Egyptian you have a word that means both good and beautiful. So they actually did it, and it's funny because it's shaped like a cross.
Really?
Well, it's a cross, but it's before, of course. It's
but I mean, I can anticipate.
It's like a cross, and then a little like this shape. It's an oval shape, basically an oval, and then you have the neck, and you have a cross, and it's actually supposed to represent a guitar.
Really?
Or like a guitar, violin, like some sort of instrument like that.
Did you do any reading or research on why you think they're equated in the
good and the beautiful?
Yeah.
No, I'm not sure.
Because again, like this is the 5th century, like that's so much later, and also this was a radical notion at the time. So it's kind of.
I mean, it's similar with love, like how the Greeks had 4 different terms of love, and we bring it down to one. I think you can do that with a lot of different things. Like you can multiply and you can unify, let's say. Yeah. So in many ways, the good and the beautiful are very close to each other. Yeah. But once you create different terms for them, then you can start to see their differences. Yeah. That's what language can do. Language can compartmentalize, but it can also broaden, which is why our sense of love is so cool in a way. Like Peugeot says, like we talk about the Greeks all the time, like they're so cool with their agape and their eros. Yeah. But actually it's quite powerful to group all of those things into each other, like romantic love and
exactly.
So I think
and he also thinks that someone like Christ is like a figure that does that too, right? Like that he is like that I think he responded to like the criticism as like, well, Christ is nothing new, like he's basically a culmination of everything that came before, and he's like, how impressive that is, like just to, like all these vastly different things, and he's able to reconcile them into one like basically one life, one philosophy, one way of living, one centrality. It's like, that's amazing. Like that is literally universality starting. And now we're talking about universal human rights and all that as if it's like normal. It's like, well, maybe that needed some preparation, right? Like that is like that we could conceive of actually all these vastly different contexts, times, regions, and actually them all being like underneath, like subservient to one common category. Yeah. Like that's a Christian thing. And now we can also see the dark side of that, right? It's like, we all need to like get to your, let's say, if I dare say, like your Bitcoin fascination, right? It's like to be like, that's also, it's scared of the centralization because it wants to centralize everything to one thing.
Yeah, and then you go the other side.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you glorify decentralized. But it's always so funny because it's this idea of decentralization that's so important right now.
Yeah.
And I think one time there was this guy on Breedlove's podcast that was like, decentralized is just because right now it's very centralized. You guys realize that, right? Like, we need to respond to the tide underneath. Like, if you're always decentralizing, at some point you're just going to disintegrate. It's same as like libertarian ideas in a certain world where there's a lot of statism and stuff like that. It makes more sense, but once that's all
exactly,
like it's all
it can be, let's say, like the margins, right, to the center, and then it's okay. But it's hard to see how you can build or construct something on top of that. And that's also like, do you know the YouTube channel Rebel Wisdom?
Yeah.
Like, so they're actually not active anymore.
Yeah, I heard Paul speak about it.
Yeah, exactly. And part of the reason for that is that I think David, who is like the main David Fuller. Yeah. He is, let's say, the main guy. I think together with forget his name, but like they're both, let's say, behind Rebel Wisdom, and they have been interviewing people like Jonathan Pajot, and he also said, like, I don't really want to associate with these labels like intellectual dark web or rebel wisdom. I'm like, these are not, actually central things where you can construct something on. Like, it's understandable. You're a counter movement. Yeah, exactly. You are a counter movement. Yeah. And it's like, that's not something you can build something out of. Yeah, like, you're really going against the system. And that's, he's saying like that's necessary, but he also realized that's what I think is the beauty of that, let's say, the end of that channel is that they were like, it's like, we've done our work now, and now it's time for like a new era, right? Like we've been on the rebellious side, but we can't stay in that forever. Like now it's time for a new era.
It was the part to play then, but now it's becoming more and more centered, and you see that with, of course, Jordan Peterson's movement. Art movement is like, this is actually turning into quite. Which is why I was so interested in to see what both John and Paul thought about it.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it was a good question. Yeah,
I was very.
And curious. I share their concerns. Like, honestly, like, I think neither of us is a particular fan of, let's say, the political side of Jordan Peterson in general. So,
it's interesting to see where it goes. But okay, let's pull back to the Transcendentals because I think there's a lot more to say about it.
For sure. Yeah.
Is there something is a place you want to dig into it?
So there's, I think we can talk about. I would like to talk about beauty, maybe. So the thing is, like with the Transcendentals, again, because it's so mysterious, just like with the Trinity, like you can keep talking about like the Trinity as a complete concept of Trinity, but one way of talking about it is just talking about the Father, or it's just talking about the Son, or talking about the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, it's even necessary.
Yeah, exactly, because like they all really like they're all one way in to eventually like, and sometimes they equate it because like someone like Jesus says like, I am the truth, so they equate him with the truth. So you can also do that, but it's a bit fuzzy because usually they also overlap in other respects. So I think we can start talking about beauty if you like. And the reason why beauty, it's a latecomer. So this is indeed the 5th century, but I think it was formalized into one of the 3 Transcendentals in, I think, by Aquinas, or like around the time. So like you have Philip the Chancellor, I know, and eventually formalized to like the notion of the 3 Transcendentals by Aquinas. So that's, I'd say, like the 12th century, something like that. So it's actually fairly recent that we talk about it in this way. At the same time, one particular reason why beauty is so interesting, like I'm curious, like before filling you in on it, do you have any sense of which way they should be ordered? Like
the true, the good, and the beautiful.
Yeah. Do you have? Yeah.
Well, I'm inclined toward thinking that the good is, say, the most important. simply because I think it's the only one that I could start to equate with God, let's say. I've often toyed with this in my journal. I have like a little pocket journal that I write ideas in now. And I was thinking about whether or not if an idea is good, if it's also beautiful and true, and same vice versa. So I was playing with these ideas.
That's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was just like.
Did you have any results? Like, did you find any ideas that were good but not true, or true but not beautiful, or like?
I think that there's a lot of those examples.
Yeah.
In a sense, but it's also the question: what kind of truth are you talking about?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, there's some pretty mundane, Sam Harris type of truths that are necessarily beautiful.
Yeah.
But what I have been finding very interesting is evaluating ideas based on their beauty. So this is not exactly answering your question, but it's something that I've been interested in playing with, like this idea of we have too many people on the planet, and Jordan gets like super riled up when he speaks about it, but like, and fair play to him, because a lot of people like they espouse this, they don't fully realize what they're saying, but it's also not a very beautiful idea. Let's say.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And so that's a quick side thought.
Yeah.
Have I thought about the order of them?
Well, those are like, I think one reason why it isn't, because obviously, like, I think we should be open for criticism in any way, like on any domain. Like, you should be able to be critical. But usually you're like, okay, usually you're critical from a perspective of something you hold dear, right? Because I value this, because I'm deeply like faithful towards this, I find it problematic that this is happening, something like that. And that's, you could say, like, one reason, if you just say, you know, there's too many humans on the planet, that could be because humanity at its core is a disease and needs to be eradicated. That could be that value. Like, we don't know. Or it could be, like, because actually I'm very concerned about the future of humanity. Yeah. Like, and actually I think humans should live, like, prosperously, like, in harmony with the earth. And that's why I'm actually concerned that maybe, you know, we're doing more than what we're owed. Maybe we're too hubristic with regard to the earth. And at the same time, we also have our place in it. But, you know, like, that shows you, like, that you're valuing something.
What is the underlying thing?
You're concerned. Well. So, and that's also why it's a dangerous idea, because usually people who just criticize, like, it's unclear what motivation they're coming from. And I would say often, if you're just criticizing without focusing on what you're valuing on, you're maybe very resentful, you know, like, and that we see that in, for instance, conspiracy theorists. We see that in radical anarchists, you know, like, again, like, I'm not in principle opposed to any of these movements. I'm just saying, and that's, I guess, my Nietzschean aspect is, like, I'm very concerned about the spirit of resentment, you know, like, it's like that spirit by itself is so, like, and I think that's one thing I mentioned in Karen Wang's podcast, like, if you're not careful, you don't know what you're cultivating within yourself, to the point that, like, as long as you're anonymous, like, who knows what you're
it reminds me of Jung, who speaks about that you're acting out a story, and that if you don't know what you're acting out, it might as well be a tragedy. It's a very, very high chance that it is, if you don't consciously aim at something. But going back to answering your question, I think that intuitively I would say the good for me is the most important. Like, I try to be good. I don't know any truly good person that is not beautiful, let's say. But there are beautiful people that are not good. So that's why intuitively I would say that I feel that beauty is lower, and then I'm not sure where truth fits in.
Like, sometimes, like, I don't know if you've ever met, like, I don't know, a saint or, like, a holy, like, person, or a monk or something like that.
Sitting right next to me.
Far from it.
sorry.
Far from it. But usually, if you meet those people, there's something that, like, that shines out of them, and that's, like, that beautiful aspect. And it's not related to, let's say, you know, their physical appearance.
It's not related to their meat intake.
Exactly. Like, it is very little to do with that. And that's also, which also shows, like, you know, it's mind over matter, because, like, you know, like, they just Like they don't really care about what they're eating.
Yeah.
Or like maybe they do obviously in some ways, but it's like they don't care from it like because they want to look as good as possible.
Yeah,
like,
no, absolutely. I've definitely seen these individuals.
Yeah.
It's really something else.
And I would say like that's why D.C. Schindler argues, and again he's very open for like alternatives to this view, but he says that's why he says the primacy of beauty, because he thinks like the beautiful is most tied to sensation. It's like, like because we really like we sense, like if we see something that's part of our sensation, right? Like it's like we see beauty in front of us, so it pulls us in. But to then see like so let's say if we encounter such an individual and we find it beautiful, it's like, we can then find out, but that's because they're good. And why are they good? Because they're aligned to like, let's say a truthful way of being. And so his point is like beauty is often like the first thing that just takes us by surprise.
Yes, it makes sense actually. Now that you're saying it.
Yeah, that's his argument. Again,
No,
you can think of other ways, and this is also a problem because beauty and like this is also like Vervaeke often talks about Paul Ricoeur and the hermeneutics of suspicion. It's like hermeneutics of suspicion is grounded in the notion that appearances, the way things appear is actually like it discloses some deep, like perverse, powerful motive. It's like, you think you're a good person, but actually like, following Nietzsche, you're resentful.
Yeah.
It's like, or you think you're what do you call it? Like you think you're working in a good system, like a good progressive system, but actually you're being exploited by the capitalists.
Yeah.
Or Freud, like you think you're looking for a partner out of a genuine sense of love, but maybe you're just repressing your love of your mother, like and the aggression you feel towards your like so there's this sense of like, and we see this often. Like I actually I was in I have to admit I was in a liberal arts and sciences bachelor program, and one thing we often do is like we look at a text and we just criticize it. We just like we're like this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is problematic.
Yeah, it's almost central actually.
I think
exactly. In university nowadays, that's what I've experienced a lot over the last 3 years as well.
And that's and people are sometimes concerned that like let's say the effects of university have some downstream effect into culture, right? And that then we start looking at traditional stories and we're like, well, that's problematic about it, that's problematic about it, that's problematic. And again, that has a positive function because you don't want to be deceived, right? But that's also then Vervaeke's point is like, it's very important to notice like focus on that too. If you don't want to be deceived, you shouldn't just be focusing on, well, I don't want to have this. You should also be focusing on, so what is it you want to be determined by? And that's why he says like the hermeneutics of beauty is also focusing on the appearances, but by the sense like that appearances can actually disclose a central aspect of reality. It's like, so not actually of some hidden agenda or hidden motive like the hermeneutics of suspicion. The hermeneutics of beauty can be like, if you're watching a great movie, if you're listening to a great piece of art, in some sense, this is actually Nietzsche's point, we should know that they're lies. Like they're not true. Like if you're watching a movie, it's acted out, But if it's great art, it's the appearance of that lie is actually disclosing something underneath it,
like
which is
symbol.
far more real, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's how beauty can really work in on us, and something can be beautiful. But again, it can also be dangerous because, like because you can listen to the wrong kind of to dangerous art forms or dangerous kind of music or dangerous like you could find someone speaks beautifully to you, but it can just be like rhetorics and it can just be bullshit in the like Frankfurtian sense of the word. So there's something very tricky about it. But then if we see like if beauty is the transcendental that takes us from the appearance to the reality behind it, then we can discover this is good, like there's a goodness about it, to eventually like this is the true way of being, which is why he says like the goodness is actually the central thing which allows its beauty to sort of shine forth. But then the reason why it's good is actually because it's aligned in truth, and that's why the truth sort of comes last. Like you find out later in some ways that the true has been so central. So I think it's a and that's it's a bit unfortunate because like the notion of transcendental has also, just like with reason, it has been taken up in philosophy, particularly in the philosophy of Kant, who speaks of transcendental idealism, transcendental realism, and his way is kind of, he's appropriating that use of the word. He's saying, I'm not talking about the transcendent, like let's say, another world. He's saying like, no, I'm talking about the, what do you call it, like the conditions that are necessary for us to experience. So he says, like, for instance, from his notion of transcendental idealism, we can infer that space and time and causality and all these categories are the necessary, like the prerequisites for us to experience reality. So he's using that notion, but he's not actually tying it into, let's say, something like an inexhaustible source, like beauty or goodness or truth. He's just using it as a category in some ways, like it doesn't have the same appeal to it. And then from that perspective, he can talk about, reason having a huge demand on us. And that's why he has also 3 critiques. So kind of similar, like to, like the Trinity and like the Transcendentals. It's the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reasons. That's indeed, you could say, pure reason is truth, practical reason is goodness, and then the critique of judgment. And judgment has to do with aesthetic judgments we make about. So like that's his philosophy of art in some ways, and that could be beauty. But in some ways, like they're separate domains in him, right? Like they're not disclosing that actually, they're pointing on towards something else. Now, no, we can just study them separately, and then they have like an autonomy in some ways, and that risks giving us sort of the notion that, okay, our reason can do something by itself. And it's like, no, but if we reason, like, no, it's through beauty that we experience the one reality, and the way in which it is itself. We find that reason is participating in something. It's never like, and that's, you could even say that Plato, who was like, who was critical of the poets in some ways, which is, again, it's partly ironic because he writes poetry, right? Like, and there's all these myths in the Republic and other works by him. So he's actually not against poetry, but in some ways he is, because poiesis, like that notion that from which poetry derives, means to produce something. So it doesn't mean to, like, let's say, to imitate or participate in something that's already there, but really to just like bring forth something out of your own capacity, right?
Yeah. So it's not interacting with another reality. It's not inventio. It's just creation.
Exactly, and that's why he is concerned. Like in the 10th book of the Republic, he also says, like, okay, I'm concerned about this. That's why, in the Republic, if we create the ideal state, and again, this should all be taken with a grain of salt, because he even says in book 9, like, if this ideal city never is brought into place, that's fine. He just says, like, it's more like a model for the soul. Like, that's the most important thing. And then other later thinkers, even in the 20th century, like Karl Popper, are like, Plato's a totalitarian because he wants to create a totalitarian.
It's just incredible. State. Like I've like, for example, Aron Brook, he's a Ayn Rand thinker. And he's like, Plato with his philosopher king type of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
You're like, oh my god. And it's even worse, because when I read Plato at 18 or 19, I felt exactly the same way. Similar to how, like, when I read the New Testament for the first time, I was like, Jesus, why don't you just become king, man? It's up for grabs. Become king, bro. Just do it.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, no, it does make a lot of sense. And that's also, like, I think, but then nonetheless, okay, given that context, he says, like, in book 10, like, we should ban the poets probably from the Republic. He gives 3 arguments. He gives a moral argument, a psychological argument, and an epistemological argument, and a metaphysical argument that, art is just reflection from a reflection, because this is already a reflection from, well, this certainly because it's a fake rose, but it's like
it's a reflection of a reflection.
Yeah, but we don't need to get into that. And but he even allows at the end of that section, he says, like, but we'll grant, if there will be a good argument made for art, it might be able to exist in our state. So he says, like, I'm not against art per se, but I am against the naive notion of art that is like that, all art is good and all art motivates us. Like, we need to be careful, because some art could also pervert us in some ways. But then it's so funny, because, like, then in book 10, like, he's finished that discussion, and then obviously he'll introduce another myth. So it's like he's just said, like, myths are not welcome. And I think one potential, and it's a common interpretation, well, it's not super common, but it's like, is to say, like, what Plato does is he's not against myth. He's just showing we need to think very carefully about the nature of reality by, thinking about the transcendentals, like the truth, the good, and the beautiful. after which we can then, integrate myths and art and all that to make sure they participate in everything that we talked about. Right?
And what Kant did is he kind of like disconnected.
Yeah, exactly. Because then you're like, oh, I could just produce it myself. And I was like, no, we first need to be we need to receive, right? We need to receive what's already there. We need to receive the good as it is, and then you can kind of see as we participate in that. Then we can create art, and really the art, and that's why Dante's Divine Comedy, like you get those types of artworks that are really profound and probably sharing that vision.
Yeah, I was thinking about modern art a while back because I went to France and we went to this museum and there was a gigantic section of modern art, and I came in and I was really bothered by it, like physically bothered, and basically I was just helped by my partner and her mother just to see how they experienced it, because they did see something in there, and I didn't understand exactly what bothered me so much about it. For me, it just felt like there was no skill involved and there was no connection to beauty. So in that sense, but more deeply, I think that modern art is like, it critiques a lot, like you said before. Similar to that, and that's okay. But I think Peugeot says this. He says that, critiquing is not a bad thing, but if critiquing becomes is the central thing. So that's, I think, where I'm really bothered by it. And what is art if it's not beautiful for me? For me, that's really a problem. And I know that's not exactly necessary. But when I think about art, that's the thing. Sorry, it's a bit of a tangent. It's a thought that I was going to forget.
It's not a tangent at all. I think it's actually super useful to what we're talking about. That it also seems that, and the same goes, I guess, for the libertarian philosophy, let's say, because the freedom from, like the two we've discussed freedom before, is very similar to the hermeneutics of suspicion, right? It's like I want to be free from deception. I don't want to be deceived by the hidden agenda. It's like, I want to do it myself. But then it's like, oh, so you want to be free to do what exactly? Oh, you haven't thought about that. And that's, if you only criticize, you're only focusing on freedom from, as opposed to also, but I want to be free to do good, to actually, to be beautiful, like, and to participate in the beautiful. And again, I don't just mean beautiful in terms of physical appearance. I actually mean like something way deeper. And that's also why indeed Plato, in like one of his later letters, which are thought to be authentic now, but he says I've made Socrates more beautiful, even though Socrates was known to be very ugly. It was actually and Nietzsche also criticized Socrates for this. He says it's strange to it's such an ad hominem attack, right? But he's like, because Socrates was ugly, that was almost already an argument against him, because he was living amongst the nobles, and all these nobles, elites, right? They didn't take him seriously, so he had to defend himself. He was I'm just going to argue my way out of this. And there's something to be said for that interpretation. But then again, that's Nietzsche's hermeneutics of suspicion, where he's it's just Socrates just trying to get rid of this humiliation, and just his own will to power. But it's actually there's also some beauty going on. But then you shouldn't just focus on the argument, but on, let's say, the literary development that's also going on in Plato's story. And then you see so much more, right?
Let me ask you a question, because you just mentioned libertarian philosophy. We spoke about it at length before. But what I'm seeing now a lot in this movement is that a lot of them are turning into Christians.
I know.
Massively. So is that an example of starting with, from an angle of, say, criticizing and seeing problems, and then adopting, realizing that it's actually not enough, and then adopting?
It depends, I think, right? Because you can imagine that many of these people, and I'm not going to make any final comments or claims about this, because I haven't spoken to these people individually, so I don't know to what extent it's authentic. But part of the question we need to ask, I guess, one question we need to ask, let me put it that way, is, Christianity is currently countercultural. The culture is in some ways, especially let's say the elite culture, and what, let's say, Hollywood and all that is focused on. It's not, obviously it's borrowing all these Christian elements, but at its core there are many non-Christian elements in it. So it's hard to say that someone who is by nature, let's say, a libertarian, who's going against the system, if they're adopting the Christian identity as long as it's against the culture, and then as soon as the culture takes it over, they're
that's
atheists
actually
again.
interesting. We'll see how that develops.
So that's a possibility, but it's also possible that indeed, like that precisely adopting that type of identity will show them, like, wait, it's not about just being here or there. It's about realizing that both of those are participating in something larger, right?
Yes.
And that even if this does become, let's say, central again in the culture, then I will not leave it behind, because it's not about kicking against something. It's actually about finding something internal underneath that.
Whereas libertarian philosophy is different than that, because once you're there, let's say once you have this world that they want to move toward, there's no reason to keep trying to put it into more decentralization.
By the way, I remember a long time ago, I think it was years ago, that evolutionary biologist Brett Weinstein, he said that he's a progressive.
Yeah.
He considers himself a progressive, even though now he's associated with anti-vax movements and now people think he's a conservative. But anyways, he thought of himself and thinks of himself as a progressive, right?
Yeah.
And he said, and I thought this was a good point, very inspiring. He said, in my life I hope to become a conservative, because if you're a good progressive, you hope to bring those things into being that would then lead you to be okay, now I want to conserve this.
Yeah.
But many conservatives cannot imagine becoming progressives, because it's part of their character. That's also this is all big five personality kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But if you're actually, let's say, consistent, you'd be I want to become a conservative. You want to always reach a state where you can conserve. But that's the thing, if you're just progressive for the sake of, it's always progressivism, it always needs to be better, well then, what is really the positive motivation there? Or just kicking against the current system? So that's also why I think, I did consider myself progressive for a very long time, and now, I'm always, let's say, floating somewhere in the political center, and somewhere, depending on the issue, I'm more of a progressive or more of a conservative. It really sort of depends. I don't, I'm also not that interested in political labels anymore, but
thank God for that.
And so
yeah, but it's funny that sometimes we absolutize, let's say, the left or the right, and it's such a weird thing to do.
Yeah.
Because you're absolutizing the relative. Literally, that's literally what you're doing.
Yeah.
To go in one way, and then I'm so surprised that I only realized this. Very very recently. Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. This, I don't know. I think people are gonna need some grace when they wake up from all of this, because this has been their identity for so long.
It's also, I think it's also it's a bit. Again, I don't want to be too critical, because these are relevant issues and they do pertain to very important decisions about our lives, right? I think politics has an effect. I'm not, at least in my opinion, I don't think politics is just some kind of fake illusion.
No,
and it
has a place.
It has a place over us. But at the same time, there's also an element about it that feels childish, because I've met people who are so into politics that it's almost they're supporting a sports team.
It's exactly the same.
No, well, for some, for those people, that you're okay. Politics has a function, but it's yes, we won, yes, we did it, and it's kind of, and you see those election, what nights, and it's well, we beat the other team, It's really that kind of energy. And again, I don't want to reduce it to that, and even I think sport teams have also a place. I actually, I'm very much in favor of that. But it's a bit more dangerous here, because this is really about values. So, let's say, you and I are both football, not American football fans. And that means to say, we support a current a team in the Netherlands, and that means that we dislike other teams in the Netherlands. But it's that's fine. It's not we dislike those people or something like that. It's not we're. But actually, in politics, it's the danger that you're those are evil people. We're good people.
That's actually so interesting. If you take that analogy a bit further, because you have the hooligans who really hate the other team.
Yeah, okay, that's fair. Yeah, that's a good point.
And so they light up fireworks outside the hotel of the other team and stuff, and they write hate letters. Yeah. But I feel nowadays in politics, a lot of people are just hooligans.
Yeah.
They're no longer support, and they're no longer seeing the underneath. For me, what I realized, also only when I took some distance from football, is that I started to love football. instead of loving the team
Yeah.
or loving the winning.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, of course,
Yeah.
we're all here for the game, and now I play
Mm-hmm.
with people that I play with every week, and
Right.
it's basically not teams against teams. We just like hustle.
Yeah.
We swap out teams every
Yeah.
week, and we're all there for a love of football.
Yeah.
And so if you're into politics
Yeah.
for a love of the good, let's say, for
Yeah,
a love,
yeah.
for that you really want society to flourish, then of course you're not going to absolutize the left or the right.
Yeah,
You're
yeah.
going to try to see how this can interplay. For example, in football, you have the competition to drive up the level and to
Yeah.
produce the most beautiful football.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's I guess the issue.
Yeah, you also like, I think for instance in movies you have the same, like you had like the Marvel fanboys and the DC fanboys, like haha the DC movies suck and the Marvel movies are great, and like
Yeah.
now haha the Marvel movies suck. It's like, well, you want both to do great, like
Yeah.
like it's, you can also tell like that's one fear. So one, I think especially historically great football team has been Ajax, Amsterdam, and they're doing terribly now, and that's like for a while that's fun for all the other teams, like haha
Yeah.
the historically great team, but you want them to come back,
Of
like you
course.
want them to like really make sure that the whole competition becomes better, and therefore more people enjoy football, and they're and to be and that's this, I think also this is to Nietzsche's point, which is where I do take him to be an important thinker as well. Like the one reason why he appreciates tragedy so much, like let's say I mean tragedy in the Homeric Attic Greek sense, and that's also his you could think of it as a counter argument against Plato, because Plato is like, art should be subservient. He's like, what the tragedians knew is that the whole of life should be embraced, and you risk, and this is a risk, at least in certain Platonists. I don't think Plato himself is culpable to this extent, but I do think like certain outgrowths of Platonism are culpable to this extent. It's just to say like, this world is bad, and just the eternal ideas are good. Or let's say from a Christian perspective, like this world is bad, let's just focus on the afterlife, and you start devaluing certain aspects that are here.
Like
and that's right. And in Plato, like that's also what D.C. Schindler points out. It's like, no, it's actually the good is precisely those things that animate this world here, which
permeates,
which is what makes it so amazing. And but still Nietzsche is concerned, because like, but what if if that becomes absolutized in a certain religion, and then you have the death of God, and then everyone is like, well, so that religion was just fake, so then this world is also useless because we thought it kept its entire value.
So you're saying
from
that the death of God comes forth from the absolutization of this world?
That's Nietzsche's
so
point. Yeah. That would
well,
be
I know it. I know it, but that's such an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah.
So it's actually the opposite of Gnosticism. In a sense. Like not exactly.
No,
but
you're right.
It's taking not absolutizing this, but doing it like this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
That's a really interesting way to look at it. Actually.
Yeah, that's also why Nietzsche says like, okay, he calls this like, John Vervaeke has the two world mythology, right?
Yeah.
And Nietzsche also says like, he kind of used that same language. To put it very anachronistically, because obviously Nietzsche is like 150 years ago. But he says like, there's one section in the Twilight of the Idols, and it's like how the true world finally became a fable. And he says, it started off with Plato, like the true world still here, and I, Plato, am the truth. That's how it starts. And you can see slowly it's like, the true world, well, it becomes something to maybe think of, like it's still... it's still a consolation for us, but we can't really reach it, and then you have Kant, and it's like, well, you can't prove the existence of the true world, but you can believe in it because we can disprove it, which is like Kant's argument for God is like, you can't prove, but there can be a moral argument for God, so from it we can derive the categorical imperative. It's just a very simple way of saying it. And then at some point after Kant, obviously, like slowly we get into nihilism, and it's like, no, just full-on atheism, in a sense, like the true world never existed in the first place. And then it's like, and then Nietzsche says very interestingly, so what remains? The apparent world. So let's say the world of appearances, perhaps. It's like, no, with getting rid of the true world, we also got rid of the apparent world. And that's the danger, right? It's like, because if for all this time, since Plato, the apparent world was grounded in the true world, then it's not like when this is gone, it's still here. It's like, no, it derived all its meaning from that, right? So you need to be very careful with that.
So this is where a lot of people critique this idea of walking away from the church and still having the values and all these things.
Well, that's what Nietzsche says, is like, you think like you're still acting out of goodness, but in some sense that has gone, and to like, let's say Peugeot's point and all that, like it doesn't have to be gone. It can sort of that's I guess the genius of the Christian story is like there's a resurrection built in, right? Like so it allows for the death of God, let's say, especially Jesus conceived as God, to then rise from the dead again. Like it's part of the story. So you can really think of like, okay, we like, let's say, like from a Christian perspective, you can accept the death of God as being part of the pattern and actually rising that. So I'm not against acknowledging the death of God, even though for other people that's a heresy because like, no, God is not dead. Well, in some ways he is.
In that sense, in the way Nietzsche said.
Exactly. And then, but then you can also see like, but he might come back, and you can also see that actually the God that died in that sense.
Yeah.
Had to die. It's very strange to say it that way, but like
because he was a demigod.
Well, in some ways, and especially the ways in which people praise him. Like if you look at the dominant religion of especially like let's say the 19th century in which Nietzsche was active, it's just pathetic.
Yeah.
And I think Peugeot says this too. Like that sort of that sense of Christianity was pathetic, and that's also why it's so interesting that when Nietzsche reads Dostoyevsky. And now the orthobros are all happy because, Dostoyevsky was an Orthodox Christian. But, like, when he reads Dostoyevsky, he's like, whoa, he gets it, there's this, it's almost like he's combining this Greek tragedy and this great art, but then with a Christian vision. And he says, like, I only know of one world in which a Jesus is still possible. That's Dostoyevsky. Like, he can still sort of, and that's, The Idiot by Dostoyevsky is like where he describes this Jesus character in the notion of Prince Mishkin, who very interestingly, to tie it back to our original discussion, says, beauty will save the world. That's the notion. Yeah.
What a beautiful character that was.
Yeah, it's
I
fascinating.
really like this character so much.
Yeah. And that's, we should know, but like it's called The Idiot, right? Yeah. Nietzsche actually rarely uses that word idiot at all. Yeah. But then he reads that book and then he uses it like a lot in the last few years. Yeah. It's very interesting. And that also but then he writes the Antichrist and he calls Jesus an idiot. So like people are like, see, like he's very much against Jesus. But then there's other praiseworthy words about it. So it's like, wait, is he in favor of him or against him? It's like, well, maybe you should think of the idiot in the Dostoyevskian sense.
Yeah, to me, he's like, he's connected to what we were speaking about.
Yeah, exactly.
That's really beautiful. Can you quickly check the time on your phone before I make people angry?
It's
okay. So I want to finish it off because we have Christmas dinner to do.
Mm-hmm.
But when I spoke to Vervaeke, I asked him about his Symphony of Sages.
Right. So great question.
This is what I really want to speak to you about because you had really interesting comments about it. So he follows multiple sages, all of them dead. And I asked him if there's particular value in following multiple or actually following one.
Yeah.
And then I think you had something to say about simply following Christ. And then, simply, let's say, only following Christ. And what Vervaeke would say is that there's all these other aspects to other sages.
Yeah.
Whereas I think you had some enlightening thoughts, so I'd love to...
Well, I mean, like what I was thinking about is, and this is actually inherent in Vervaeke's ideas, or at least not his ideas, like even that I think he would blush when I would call it his ideas. Like it's really like the source material that he is teaching and that he is incorporating into his work, let me put it that way, is he's looking at the notion of agape, and he says agape is that which, really makes us into persons, like gives us personhood in some ways. And that's why it was the revolution. The death of Christ, but what happened? We had the revolution amongst, in Rome, like non-Roman citizens, and those would be like women and slaves and all those people who are like on the margins of society. All of a sudden had a story that was like, no, we are persons, like we have personhood. So if you take that aspect, right, of agape, and there's something to be said for it because, Paul, obviously inspired by Jesus, says like in Christ, we are neither Greek nor Jew. This is great for let's say the gender progressive folks. He says we are neither man nor woman. He says like we're all united in Christ. Like he says, and this is a very important notion because it says like in some sense we are all our personhood is far more profound than these individual identities. So I think what is possibly conceivable by the Christian Revolution is to say like, this is all partaking of some universal history and this universal cosmic story that is setting about. So then when we look at these other sages, these other individuals, we can relate them to our own tradition from this Christian perspective. And I actually find it somewhat difficult to sometimes do that from those individuals from a non-Christian viewpoint, because I get fully into their world, but without the agape aspect, I actually like, okay, oh right, I need to take the agape aspect again to really notice, like, okay, yes, Spinoza is in the same story eventually as Socrates, and then as the Buddha, as the Christ, but I'm like, yeah, but the reason why I conceive of them as all of them as like separate persons with separate identities, with separate stories and separate things to teach me, you know, it's like, is because they're all persons, because I'm actually like, yes, they're all humans and they're all, you know, dare I say, children of God, like, you know, in the theological language. And it's from this perspective that I'm like, I totally see his point. Like, he would feel unfaithful to those individuals would he not acknowledge how profoundly indebted he is to, you know, reading them and really doing Lectio Divina on them. Yeah. But at the same time, I do feel like, yeah, okay, but the reason why you're able to do that at all is because of the Christian Revolution. Yeah. And I know that he puts it the other way around. He said, like, the reason why we can relate to sages like Christ at all is because of the Socratic Revolution. So I see that point too. But I think specifically the agape personhood point is introduced by Jesus, and therefore I think that might be more profound. Yeah. And allows us to relate to it from a Christian perspective. But
that you're saying that you could also follow just Christ and then
well, I mean, like, I think in some ways, and that this is my own personal journey, so you always need to be careful with projecting your own personal journey onto the world, right? Yeah. This is the great psychoanalytic insight. But my own personal journey, as I already mentioned, I'm not a churchgoer, so that means that I'm profoundly always aware that I'm not sure where I'm standing. I'm not sure what my identity is right now in some ways. So I can tell that there is a longing in me for a stable identity from which I'm able to integrate everything else. Yeah. And that's the thing, like, that's the danger with, you know, not having a place to stand. This is also something that Peugeot talks about all the time, is to be like, well, okay, you know, like, how do you then pick and choose? Is it because you are the arrogant, and he's not saying this against Vervaeke, I'm just saying, like, you know, but if you're spiritual, not religious, like, just, you know, like a consumerist, I just pick and choose a little bit from that religion. It's like, well, but from where? Just from your arrogance, where you think like, okay, I can do that. And then we come back to the start of this conversation where you do like, from that reason perspective, where you can do it, where you can choose it yourself, you know. It's like, no, you're called to something outside of yourself. And that's where I think it's more profoundly possible from this Christian perspective. Yeah,
that's really good. I hope that John will get to see this. See if
maybe
to say about it.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much for your time. I hope the recording went well. I just heard a little noise, but we'll see.
Yeah. No, I think that was my email, but don't worry about it.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, and let's.
Thank you so much.
Get back to the family.
You're doing a great job, and Merry Christmas, everyone.
And keep an eye out. I'll link the channel down below on which your talk is going to appear. I only did a talk at the Breakwater Festival about Nietzsche. And I think it was very well received there, so I'm excited to watch it myself. So we'll link it down below.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.